I had two coaching offers, Federer and Murray, and I said no to them both. So I think I sort of set the bar pretty high.
And I think that's when our kind of rivalry started in '95. But then '96, I feel like, is the year where you said, okay, I'm not going to be behind this guy.
But who would win if you both stepped on court today?
Welcome to Off Court with Greg Rusedski. I'm joined by Kevin Palmer from Tennis 365, Ashley Neaves, the tennis mentor, and our special guest today is Tim Henman. But before we get started, Tim, I got to tell you, Kevin Palmer, who I started this podcast with, is a Tim Henman fan, not a Greg Rusedski fan. So I don't know how we got him on board. But I also wanted to say, Ashley, we're going to talk about our rivalry, was 5 years old at the time, so he doesn't even remember Rusedski Henman.
Of course. Hey, I was born in '89, so I remember the later years, but I believe the head-to-head wasn't so much in Greg's favour later on when I started watching. Yeah, I think I saw slightly more Tim wins, I would have to say. Sorry, Greg.
Oh, that's all right. Not a problem there whatsoever. But, Tim, we want to start this interview with asking you about your family history, because I know your great-grandmother was the first to serve overhand. You had great grandparents and grandparents who played at Wimbledon, and you followed the tradition. So can you go back in the history of your family with Wimbledon and with tennis?
Yeah, that's right. Well, first and foremost, thanks so much for having me. It's great to speak to you guys, and I'm enjoying your work. So yeah, the family side is my mum's side of the family, and my great grandmother Ellen Stowell Brown. She played at Wimbledon, I think, in around 1911. And, back in the day when they were wearing the long dresses and corsets, it was not particularly easy to serve overarm. A lot of the women served underarm. And she happened to be really the first lady that served overarm. And then when my grandmother, so her daughter, was playing, she was very much encouraged to serve underarm because it was a lot more straightforward. And I guess on grass, it could be still quite effective. And so my grandmother ended up being the last lady to serve underarm. And quite a funny story that it must have been, I'm giving my mum's age away here, so I apologize to my mum, but in 1946, my grandparents played mixed doubles together on centre court. And my grandmother was pregnant with my mother. So my mum does try and claim that she's played on centre court, but I haven't quite given her that one.
Tim, with that background, they always say you had a tennis court in your back garden. Is that true? I mean, with that background, did you have any choice to go into tennis, or was it kind of thrust upon you almost?
Well, we did have a sort of a hard court in our back garden, and I was very lucky to be given the opportunities of playing a lot of sport. And I got two older brothers who are 4 and 5 years older than me. My dad was pretty accomplished at quite a few different sports. I would say that hockey, squash, tennis, and football were his 4 main sports. So I grew up in an environment where after school we played sport, and that, included rugby, football, cricket, hockey, squash, golf, tennis, you name it. But, my brothers, they love sport, but they didn't really have the inclination as I did to really want to pursue one of them. And I knew from a very young age that, tennis was what I wanted to do. And obviously, having just discussed my family background, was there any, pressure, or was I aware of it? I wasn't even aware of it. I played tennis because I loved it. And, I felt very fortunate for that.
I hear you picked up a racket very early. I think you were like 2.5 years old, and you really became inspired when you watched Bjorn Borg when you were 6. From then onwards, I guess, hearing a little bit about your history, you were a bit of a late bloomer when it came to competitive tennis. When was it that you really felt like, tennis was going to be your career? Was there a moment, or was it a gradual thing through the years?
Yeah, look, I mean, where I grew up, we lived in a small village called Weston-on-the-Green, which is north of Oxford. And right next to our home, about 100 yards away, was Western Manor Hotel. And it was a country house hotel. And they had a squash court, and we had a tennis court, as I mentioned. And my parents sort of very early on, probably when I was just born, they sort of said to the hotel, if your guests would like to use our tennis court, that's fine, as long as we can use your squash court. And so the sort of deal was agreed. And I think in the first 16 years of my life, we had one guest that played on our court one afternoon for about an hour. And I would say that my brothers and I in winter used their squash court probably 8 days a week. So it was a good negotiation. So I actually played squash before I played tennis. I played, probably when I was about 2.5, because it was lighter with a wooden racket. And so I've always loved squash. Yeah, as I then, transitioned, my mum took me to Wimbledon when I was 6. I saw Borg play. That was definitely a defining moment. 11, I got offered to go on the David Lloyd Academy, moved away from Oxfordshire and went to school in London, and was there for 5 very happy years. Managed to convince, my parents that I should leave school at 16 to pursue full-time tennis. And that was the time when, I hadn't grown. I was still, pretty small, and your results in junior tennis can be dictated quite a lot by your size and strength. And so having been, good at 11 or 12 when I was number 2, number 3 in the country, then by, 16, 17, I was probably, 8 to 10 in the country. That was a challenging time. I think, I wasn't winning many matches, but I still had the hunger and desire and motivation to work hard. And then sort of when I moved out of juniors, 18, started playing satellites, which were 4-week events and traveling a lot. And then by 18, 19, I started to grow. That was when my results really started to kick on. Once I started picking up the ranking points and probably got inside, 200, then I thought, wow, I'm making some good strides here.
The other thing I wanted to go back, I want to take you back in time because you grew up with Jamie Delgado, and Jamie Delgado was winning the Orange Bulls under 12s, under 14. And I remember you had a coach by the name of Steve Shore who didn't have too much confidence in your games. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, I mean, at that time, so I was 3 years older than Jamie, and as we know, Greg, in juniors, if someone's a year younger than you, that sort of seems quite a lot. If they're 2 years younger, then they're from a different era. So 3 years was just absolutely ridiculous. And Jamie, at 13, 14 was so good. He was physically strong. I mean, let's not forget he was shaving twice a day at the age of 13 or 14. Yeah, it coincided, as I said, when I was 16 or 17, and I'd left school, and really I wasn't particularly good. I was enthusiastic. Steve Shaw, definitely his priority was Jamie Delgado, and at that stage, I remember my parents having a conversation with the setup at David Lloyd, and really, the best they could offer me at that stage was me to be really hitting a lot with Jamie and supporting him, and yeah, I mean, we had a conversation, Steve and I, and he didn't really see much of a future for me in professional tennis. So that was a moment in time where it was tough that I didn't necessarily see a future there. So I was lucky then that Billy Knight, who was in charge of men's professional tennis, he was definitely one of the biggest influences on my career. He was in charge of the men's game. He was starting up some traveling squads, and he gave me the opportunity of working with David Felgate, and that ended up being a very successful partnership.
Yeah, but did that not give you like motivation? Because Steve said there's no way this guy Henman's making it. Delgado's all the way. So it's kind of like, we all have our drivers. I had a chip on my shoulder. That was my driver. Did that help drive you once you had that partnership with Dave Felgate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it did it. In all honesty, Greg, and that's where everybody's journey is different. I was, as you were, highly motivated and determined, but if anything, I was, I was pretty sort of shocked, and I remember I was keeping a training diary at that stage because Steve had got me to do some work with a sports psychologist that I felt was very beneficial. I was keeping a training diary, and I remember, I'd write in what I was working on, some of my match analysis, and And I remember that day I sat down, when my coach, didn't necessarily think that I had, too many opportunities in professional tennis, and I didn't know what to write. And I've got my diaries from 16 until I was 33, looking at, all the things that I was working on and match analysis. And I remember I didn't really know what to write because I was a bit embarrassed for myself, I think. And I remember, and I've certainly read it in the past, that I felt that this was a turning point. I had a choice to make. There was a fork in the road. Either I, would not believe in myself, or I'd believe in myself and keep working hard and see where that took me. And fortunately for me, I decided to keep working hard. And but I don't sort of resent that, or it's not easy. There are plenty of players, Greg, I'm sure you and I have looked at over the years and thought, well, they're not great, and they've got a long way to go, and vice versa. You see some hugely talented players that don't really make the grade. And yeah, that was just part of my journey.
I was going to say, did you ever come close to having been told you're not going to make it? Did you ever think that's it, kind of thing? You have to, or do you want to? Did it ever get that close that you thought you'd give up?
No, definitely not. And why didn't I sort of think that? I think when I reflect back, when I just started on the David Lloyd Academy when I was 11, I had an elbow injury, and it was probably from overplaying, and basically, my muscles were getting quite strong, but my bones were still soft, and basically in my elbow, the muscles pulled away a piece of bone, and I basically had a loose body in the elbow joint. I wasn't allowed to play for 6 months when I started back. I was only allowed to play 5 minutes a day for the first week. I was only allowed to play 10 minutes a day for the second week. So it took me 2 years to build up from having the injury to playing a tournament again. And that was sort of almost much more challenging, because I loved tennis. I was passionate about it. I wasn't allowed to play. So I think, when you deal with adversity, it's character building, and you do have an option. You can say, well, I'm going to give up, or I'm going to keep fighting. And I think those are just, some of the bumps in the road that I've had along the way.
Really interesting. I mean, Tim, if we go back again, you mentioned that you kind of didn't get the results in your younger years. You were slightly smaller and weaker than some of the other players, and you kind of started to excel slightly later on in your teens as you started to feel stronger. And we had a similar story from Andy Murray, actually, talking about he shaped his game around the fact that he was much smaller than the players that he used to train with, so he had to win in different ways. He had to, become a terrier on the court. He had to learn to defend. He had to learn to play in a slightly different way. And I think it's an important message. I, as a coach, have to speak to a lot of parents and kids about expectations when it comes to results at a young age. And how do you feel about the focus around results versus process for young juniors, and then going into the adult game?
Yeah, definitely. Look, the point that you make is absolutely spot on. That you've got to keep developing your game, and for me, I grew up on faster courts. I like coming to the net. But when you're small and you don't have a very good reach and you don't have a lot of power, that's sort of a high risk strategy. But I think I had a good understanding of the way that I wanted to play, and then I needed to grow into that game. And so, 11 or 12, I had the physicality against my opponents. At 16, 17, I didn't. But it didn't deter me from, really trying to play a way that I felt would be successful when I got bigger, stronger, and faster. And so, I think that was what gave me the opportunity of developing rapidly at 18, 19, because I was very clear in my own mind about the way that I wanted to play. And now I had the physicality to go with it. So, I think as I have referenced to many, juniors or people that I've come across, I don't know my highest junior world ranking. I never won a match in a junior Grand Slam. I lost first round of the Australian Open when I played it a year early. I lost first round of the French in my last year of juniors. I lost first round of Wimbledon. I never played the US Open juniors. And in my last junior match, at the Orange Bowl under 18. I lost 6-1, 6-1 first round. And so I think that's, that's my journey. And so, it's probably quite fun if you're, good in juniors and you're winning those tournaments, but it's not the be all and end all. It's about having a game that's going to develop and be a good professional.
There's an interesting story about Soderling, actually. He was unbeatable as a junior, I believe, and when he broke into the adult game and started losing every week, as professional tennis players pretty much have to do, he really struggled. And there was a moment, I think, obviously he made it to a very, very high level still, but there are a lot of juniors out there that are prodigies and getting a lot of wins and working on their game to win as 12 and 13-year-olds might not be the right way to play to develop your game in the longer run. So it's really interesting to hear your story.
Yeah, process, not outcome, isn't it? You've really got to think about that journey.
The other thing is, Tim, you've told us a lot about what happened in your junior career, your self-belief you had in yourself, which was so strong. What was that moment when you turned pro and said, okay, I can really do this? Was there an event like in the Futures or Challenge or something where, I can transition, I can get into the top 100 one day? When did that moment occur, or when did you start believing that could happen?
Yeah, I think, as I said, I sort of broke into the top 200, and one of my big breakthroughs was in Tokyo, when I qualified for a tour event for the first time, and in the first round I played Kelly Jones, who you'll remember, Greg. It was a decent singles player, very good doubles player, but it was a good opportunity. He was at the end of my career. And then second round, as I like to remind him whenever I see him, I played Darren Cahill, who was coming back from knee surgery. Protected rankings in those days were used for seeding as well. And so he hadn't really played much. I beat him second round, and then had to play Pete Sampras when he was world number one, and I was probably ranked 220 or something, and I lost 6-1, 6-2 in about 51 minutes. I was pretty chuffed with my 3 games, but all of a sudden, I remember I got $13,000, and I thought I'd won the lottery. I couldn't believe it, and I broke the top 200, and that was definitely a big moment to be on the tour playing someone like Sampras. But in September, that was March. It was, Tokyo outdoors, Greg, which you played many times. That year in September, I broke my leg. I was playing in a challenger in Singapore, and I was playing Chris Wilkinson. I got to about 150. And so, you talk about those setbacks. That was another massive setback. I was out for 5 months. My ranking went down, to 300. So I was really, making some good progress, had a big setback. And then end of 95, again, that was when I really made some big strides, ended up finishing the year, I think 99 in the world. And that obviously sets you up for Australia. So, that was the time when I thought, yeah, I'm really making some headway here.
96 was the Wimbledon year, when it sort of started to roll and the media started to get interested.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm also trying to think, and it was, I think, a big influence, and Greg will remind me. So obviously Greg coming to the UK totally changed the landscape in terms of, rankings, and Jeremy Bates and Mark Petchey and Andrew Castle a bit before me, they were good players. They were top 100. But Greg coming, I think were you around 50 at the time, Greg, in the rankings?
Yeah, it was 95 when we first met in that May just before the Wimbledon Championships.
Yeah.
And I was top 50, and at the time you had Petch complaining about me coming open. You weren't complaining about it. Jeremy Bates wasn't complaining about it.
Yeah.
But there was a little bit of controversy. Is he the plastic Brit coming over? Is he just coming over because he basically knows he's going to go in with British #1? There really wasn't that sort of threat and that drive or that game to be able to get to the top of men's tennis. And I think that's when our kind of rivalry started in 95. But then 96, I feel like, is the year where you said, okay, I'm not going to be behind this guy.
Yeah, I mean, that's you fundamentally, hit the nail on the head. And I'm sure from your point of view, when I was coming up the rankings, then, there was going to be that rivalry. And there's always been that sort of extra focus on, British rankings. I mean, very rarely do you hear Rafa Nadal called the Spanish #1 or Federer called the Swiss #1. A little bit in American, maybe it's more to do with the Grand Slam nations. But as you say, 96, I started in the top 100 and, had some decent results, got to Wimbledon when I was probably, I can't remember. Was I 75 in the world, but, had to play Kafelnikov first round, who just won the French Open and having watching Bjorn Borg as a 6-year-old, 15 years later to get my opportunity on centre court, that was definitely a special day, one that I felt like I'd been preparing for, to go out there and save 2 match points and win 7-5 in the fifth was for sure such an important moment in my career to feel so comfortable in that environment.
Tim, I wasn't working in the tennis media at the time, so you can't blame Greg or you can't blame me for anything that was written that was bad at the time. But what was your honest sort of feeling there? So 30 years on, the sort of dust has settled, and this guy comes over from Canada. Are you welcoming it, thinking it's good for the Davis Cup team? Or are you thinking, I could do without this?
Yeah, I mean, I look, and Greg and I will know that, we had our ups and downs, and when Greg arrived, I didn't really see him as a competitor at that stage. He wasn't really sort of on my radar. My ranking was a lot lower. I had a lot to do to get in the conversation. And so, then once we, rose up the rankings, and then I get to 50 and Greg's, probably around there, maybe a bit higher. And then suddenly, we're knocking on the door of the top 30, the top 20. I think I always felt that I had a perspective of where I wanted to be in world tennis. And the ranking, yes, of course, I'm aware I want to be British #1. I would rather be British #1 than British #2. But, it was to a certain extent secondary. And that's where, when you reflect going back to different eras, you'd much rather be British #2 and 10 in the world than British #1 and 95 in the world. And I think that's where Greg and I changed, the landscape. All of a sudden there was, belief that we could compete for big titles. When you reflect on, Davis Cup, on the one hand, I don't know how Greg feels about this. Our doubles record was amazing. And, we only lost our last doubles match on some awful, dreadful clay court in Austria when it was basically snowing. We won London together. We were a great partnership. There's no two ways about it. However, we never won a world group match, and that is it's very surprising, I think, for some of the matches we played. But I think it's disappointing with our ability that we couldn't. And we, there were some brilliant matches, but I would love to have had a proper Davis Cup run, and we weren't, for whatever reason, able to do that.
Well, I think also, if you got to look at who we played, I mean, we played America, where I lost to Courier in the fifth when we first qualified. Then they brought Thomas Johansson in for Sweden, who just won the Australian Open, as their substitute. So we had some brutal draws. I mean, when I retired, I was like, God, could we have Andy Murray and Jamie Murray? That would have been a dream, with yourself as well on the team. That would have been the ultimate. And it's great to see Andy, having accomplished that and won the Davis Cup with his brother and the rest of the team. But also, I think you made a very good point there. I think by having two of us with the same ambitions, as you said, we didn't want to be British #1. We wanted to try to be world #1. And I think when you had your breakthrough in 96, that's when my off season was probably the hardest I had going into 97, because you surpassed me as British #1. You were top 20 in the world. I was about 38, 40 in the world, and neither one of us liked being #2. Let's be honest. We all just wanted to be #1. And I think we've got to kind of go back to that 97, where I think myself personally, I was disappointed because I was in the quarterfinals playing Peeling. You were in the quarterfinals playing Steek. And if we won our matches, it would have been a semifinal and being able to play at Wimbledon, which we never managed to do. And, that to me is one of those matches I was kind of like, I wish we could have had that matchup. And that's where the Rusedski-Henman sort of rivalry really took off, I felt. What are your thoughts on that and that year in 97?
I mean, let's it's unusual for me to have a little dig at Wimbledon, Greg, but let's not forget that 2 Brits in the quarterfinal, and if I'm correct, we both played on court 1.
Yes, that's right. I didn't want to bring it up
No
because I know
way.
you're so
Well,
involved in the club.
well, I'm involved in the club now, and it certainly wouldn't happen now. But having said that, I'm not sure it made much difference for me. I lost to Michael Steek, sort of 6-3, 6-4, 6-2, and I felt that match was its closest in the knockup. I felt like I was on. I felt the first 5 minutes of the knockup I was on. I was on level terms, but after that, it was one way traffic. No, but as you say, Greg, that definitely, when you reflect on, I probably slightly surprised myself overtaking you in 96. And then the way that you played in 97, obviously being in the quarters at Wimbledon, making the final in US Open, you go into the top 10, it's like, wow, this is game on. And we were playing well and moving up the rankings. And then you reflect over the next, 3, 4, 5 years. I think that's where, to have us in the top 10, in the top 20 for a long period of time was good for us both. There was, healthy competition. We had our bumps along the road, but that's inevitable in an individual sport when you're competing. But as I said, I've said it, and I think you said the same. You definitely had a big influence on my career, and it was a very positive one.
I mean, everybody, if you think about Alcaraz and Sinner nowadays, and they're pushing each other on, you need that person in your life to push or to pull you up. And was there another player in that mix? I know you two obviously had your own rivalry. You could answer this individually, Greg and Tim. Was there one player that really influenced your kind of progression in your tennis in your later years?
Yeah, I mean, around that time, I was friendly with Pete Sampras, and I was very close with his coach Paul Annacone, who obviously went to coach me, and so he was someone with his grass court record I looked up to, immensely, and was one of the greatest players of all time. So I wouldn't unfortunately put myself in the same bracket as him, but he certainly had an influence. And then. Around that time, who did I play a lot? I played Hewitt a lot, which was a bit of a nightmare. I didn't like playing Hewitt, and that was, also the time when Federer was coming through. So those were the best of the best, and anytime you had the opportunity of playing them, it was going to be an exciting challenge. But yeah, I think that was when I reflect on when did I play my best, probably from, 2008 until 2004. Those were 1998 to 2004.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how those guys, because like Sampras was the gold standard. He was the GOAT at the time. And I
Yeah.
was lucky that I spent a lot of time with Jim Courier and with Pete Sampras when I was a 17-year-old in Florida. So I didn't get as friendly as those guys. I kind of played the Pete game. You know how Pete kind of stayed aloof apart from the very few people? I mean, for him to have a friendship with you was quite unique. And you have a good friendship with Roger because you actually, Roger's much easier to have a friendship with.
Yeah.
Pete is much more
Yeah.
reclusive. And
Yeah.
both very, very good
what,
guys.
what I would say, Greg, is you're absolutely right. Pete was let very few into his inner circle. And I think, looking back on it, he obviously wasn't threatened by my game, because if he was, he wouldn't have let me in. And there's a funny story because, as you will know, Greg, I mean, Pete was not a good practice player. He would be on the court, he'd be pretty lackadaisical with his footwork, and it was all about him just getting a feel for the ball off the surface. But you and I and the vast majority of other players would say, you've got to practice the way that you want to compete with that type of intensity. So when we used to play practice sets, I would say conservatively, I would win 8 out of 10 practice sets against Sampras. So in 1998, when we play in my first Wimbledon semi-final, I promise I walked on the court thinking, I have got a very, very good chance here. And I remember we'd warmed up, we'd hit our ground strokes, our volleys, and we went back to serve. And I was just getting the balls from the ball boy, ball girl in the corner. And suddenly I heard this noise behind me, and I was like, what was that? And it was Sampras warming up his serve. And I was like, oh my goodness, he's got about 3 more gears in his serve. But yeah, no, it was amazing times. And, to be a part of, you were playing at the same time, to see Sampras get to 14 slams and, win not only Wimbledon, his 13th slam, and then US Open his 14th. I just would have bet my bottom dollar no one was going to get near that.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to have that wonderful quote in 2002. Remember that? So I was up, I lost in 5 sets, and I had set points in 4 sets. And I said, there's no way he's winning the title, because he had like Ruddock, Haas, Agassi to go through. Me opening my big mouth and putting my foot in it, he goes in to win the US Open. It's not unusual for me to do that.
That was pretty amusing, Greg. What do you say? You said he's a step slow.
No, a step and a half, because everybody in the locker room, remember in Long Island, he'd lost early. He'd lost to George Bastel at Wimbledon, and everybody in the locker room saying it's not the same Sampras. And
Yeah.
I basically will never discount a great champion ever again. But that gets me into an interesting discussion, because I know Kevin wanted to ask this question, which is about the media we had to deal with, because we had 7 tabloids, 5 newspapers. I mean, it was crazy. It's not like social media today. And it was kind of a game within a game dealing with the media. And, how do you think the media treated you and treated me if you look over our careers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It was so different. For me, when I got disqualified, 1995, when I hit the ball girl, I was sharing a flat with Andrew Richardson up in Wimbledon Village. And the morning after I got disqualified, he went out and bought all the newspapers. He bought all the tabloids. He bought everything. And we sat in the kitchen and read every one of them. And I was in a state of shock. And, throw in Tarango's quote that it said that I hit the ball so hard it could have killed her. I think that was a slight exaggeration. So, in that moment in time, I thought I was treated very unfairly. But I then, sort of vowed to myself that I would never read the newspapers again. And I could probably count on one, maybe two hands, the number of times I read the papers in my career. I think, look, I would reflect on it and say that I think I had a good relationship. I'm sure there were times where, I got some pretty heavy stick for not winning Wimbledon. I remember one occasion in 2002, when Agassi, Sampras, and Murat Safin lost in the second round, and I was in the other half. I'd won my first round. I came into the locker room, and there were quite a few guys, and a couple of them had newspapers, and they were looking at me, and I sort of said, "Guys, what's going on?" And they said, "Oh, have you read the newspaper?" And it was the Mirror, at that stage. And I said, "Well, no, I don't really read the newspapers." And they said, "Oh, you got to see this." And it was front page, and it was sort of half page picture of me. And then above that, the headline, it said, "Tim ... If you choke this year, we'll never forgive you." And that was when I was in the second round, and I said to them, "Welcome to my world." So look, um, likewise, Greg, I think, we had our bumps in the road with the press, and you probably more than me, but I look back on it and it was great times. I mean, we had a big contingent of tennis media that followed us. The game was and still is popular. There's not a lot I would have changed about it. I really did. I enjoyed it, and now to look back on it, yeah, it just goes with the territory.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's no media like it in the world, especially for me coming over in 95. It was a huge story when I decided to represent Britain. I remember the headlines. I lost to Petch in Queens. I lost to Javier Frana in Nottingham, and headline going into Wimbledon, he's definitely British. He can't win a match.
Yeah, they were pretty sharp with stuff like that.
And then I remember with you in 95 when you brought the flowers to the ball girl that you supposedly hit the ball too hard at, and she went in for the full kiss on you.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't one of my finer moments, that's for sure.
So, I look back and I laugh at it, but I don't think the press nowadays would get away with some of the things they said about us back then.
No,
Especially the way we are with this society and with the way things are nowadays. But I look at it, I would never read the press like you, but I'd have family members who would tell me what's in the press. And I didn't want to
Yeah.
know. Can you please
No.
not tell me? Because it's hard enough trying to win tennis matches and then dealing with the press. And you're right, it was a big deal, our rivalry. Then we were lucky that Andy Murray came along and we got into media and did all those things. And it's great to have journalists following us week in, week out, because it was a really great time for us and a big deal. So I look
Yeah.
back at it as a positive.
Yeah, definitely. And look, like any industry or sport or life in general, there's gonna be bumps in the road, and as you say, the media landscape has changed, and I think it's changed enormously, and I think there's far better support for the players, and that's a good thing, but just even that. And I'm going to use the word camaraderie. I think when there was that big cohort when we were playing in the slams, Greg, and it was special. There were there were people that we probably got on better with than others, but it was a moment in time that will never be the same. And to be a part of that, I think was very special.
Remember the one story you told me about, Tim? You were driving your car and you're just basically on the motorway, and someone looked to their right and forgot to hit the brakes and smashed into the car in front of you. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they weren't going too fast, I hasten to add, but yeah, that was a bit unfortunate. I didn't hang around to find out, what had happened, but yeah, some crazy times out there.
Guys, as the media guy here, I should probably chip out. I think the media understand what success is in sport, but do you think the British public understand that being 4 in the world, reaching a Grand Slam final, reaching 6 Grand Slam semis, both win in Paris, have an incredible success and longevity in the sport? Do people in Britain, the amount of times I've been at tennis clubs playing at my incredibly low level and they say Henman was a choker, never won anything, that kind
Yeah.
of, it annoys me. I mean, I don't know if it annoys you, Tim, but it's kind of, they don't understand that being world number 4 for that long is an incredible achievement, do they?
No, but I look, the conversation around success is not about winning and losing. It's about maximizing your potential. And for Greg and I both to be, 4 in the world was as good as we're meant to be because we gave everything we could to in every area of our game. And so look, I think when you live certainly in a Grand Slam nation, and you play well at Wimbledon, then the narrative becomes a bit binary. Certainly, if you're deep in the second week, it's about whether you win it or whether you don't. And Craig and I didn't win it. So look, and again, I really going back to not reading the papers and kind of a little bit to do with my upbringing. I'm pretty clear about what's important to me, and club players at tennis clubs, with their opinions about whether I was a good player or not. It really doesn't faze me, and they're perfectly entitled to their opinion. That's their prerogative. But that's why when I reflect on my career, I am thrilled with what I was able to achieve. And look, my ultimate dream was to win Wimbledon. I'm not denying that, and I think I was good enough to win Wimbledon. Unfortunately for me, there were players that were better, and Sampras was one of those. Hewitt was one of those. Ivanisevic was a better player than me. I could have won that match, but I look back with a few disappointments, but no regrets.
And when you talk about success, the numbers are incredible, Tim, but it's more than that. You had a lot of kids watching you play tennis, and I was one of them. And I know Greg was joking at the start that I was too young to see your rivalry, but one of my earliest memories of watching professional tennis was, you're not going to like it, Tim, but the match against Goran. And I want to ask you about it because I got very emotional watching it, and I'm sure you did too. But can you tell me how that went? I mean, you won the third set, 6-love. I think you lost 4 points in that set.
Yeah.
And then I think it was 2-1 in the fourth. You had the rain delay. You had to go off court. A couple of rain delays. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in your head in that break? How it affected you and how the match came out as it did?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I'd played Goran 4 times before that match, and I'd beaten him on all 4 occasions. So look, he's dangerous on grass. He's a big lefty, and we know they are, big lefty serves are difficult. But I liked the matchup. I was lucky to be 1 set all. Don't get me wrong. definitely had the upper hand of those first 2 sets, but I managed to play a good tiebreak, hang in on my own serve, play a good tiebreak. And I knew that Goran should be up 2 sets to love. He knew that he should be up 2 sets to love, and he wasn't. And that's when, for him, the wheels came off. So I'd never won a set so quickly in my whole professional life, and to only lose 4 points and win it in 14 minutes, it's like, okay, this is going well. And then, on serve in the fourth, doesn't really matter what the score is. It's, there's no breaks, and it starts raining. So the first thing to point out was that in the fourth round, I'm pretty sure it was the fourth round that year, I played Todd Martin, and I was down 2 sets to 1, and my back had seized up, and I really was struggling, and I had to come back the next day. So got treatment, took some anti-inflammatories, felt much better, and won the fourth and fifth. And so that was an example of an interruption that benefited me. So and the same from junior tennis playing in the UK, you have plenty of matches that are stopped overnight. So you are used to it, admittedly not often in the semis of Wimbledon. So, it's services, it's normal. So come back on the Saturday. I'm up 2 sets to 1. It goes with serve, gets through to the 4-set tiebreak. And this time I lose it. And let me add that, Goran was done on the Friday, in the beginning of that 4th set, he was gone. So, there's no doubt that rain delay for him to get off court, to regroup, to talk to his team, find his rhythm again on serve was advantageous, as it was for me against Todd Martin. And so, once we get into the 5th set, it's all to play for. And then the rain comes again. So this is no doubt unusual. I don't think I ever played a match that was interrupted twice and played over 3 days. I think I beat Courier at Wimbledon that was over 3 days, but we didn't play for a whole day in 99. And the bizarre bit of the match was when we came back on the Sunday, which is obviously, men's finals day, it was 3-2 in the 5th, and we only played 4 games. So Goran broke me once, serves it out, and we probably played for 15 minutes. So then to get back to the locker room, having just lost in a Wimbledon semi-final, it was hugely anticlimactic because there hadn't really been a big build-up of adrenaline. We hadn't been out there for 2, 3, 4 hours. And I remember sitting in the locker room, not many people around because, everyone's gone home. All the other players have lost. And I just sort of sat there thinking, was that it? It's my 3rd semi-final in 4 years at Wimbledon. And I felt very sort of numb. It was almost, not like I was in shock, but it was just bizarre. And then went and did the press, and then, went home. And over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 days, it sort of all sunk in, see Goran win on the Monday. That was definitely the toughest match in my career to lose. Definitely, if I could play one match again, it would be that one against Goran.
And if you could give yourself a talking to before going back on, after the first rain delay, what would you say to yourself?
I would have said, keep holding your serve. It's another day. And so what you do on grass against a big server, and, you concentrate on your own deal. And so, find your rhythm, hit your spots, get to the net when you can. And that's exactly what I did. So, that's when it's sport, it's very easy in hindsight, but I look back on that match and, he served 35 aces or something. I only lost my serve twice in 5 sets. What? I mean, maybe build a roof, but I'm not sure. Not sure there's much else I could have done.
That's what I was going to say. Nowadays, you're not going to have that happen, with the rain delays, especially if you're on center or number 1, you get 15, 20 minutes and you're straight on. I mean, that's a time where if you would have had the roof and the momentum with you, it could have been a different story. We all have like 1 or 2 matches in our career where we have those feelings, what if, but I kind of felt like you maximized everything you had. So I kind of wanted to go back to that thing which Kevin brought up as well, where he said, looking back at our careers and what club players and people say, on the tour, everybody thought of Tim Henman as a maximizer. He got the most out of everything he did. You know, the general public, it's like saying to England, oh, they should win the World Cup every year in the European Championships.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. You know, if you're
Yeah.
four in the world, you've had an amazing career. And, you know, for me, the match that digs me the most is the US Open final, just
Yeah.
because I felt that was my opportunity. So we all have those things. And then we've been so lucky after our careers to be able to go into the media and into, you know, after retirement to get into that. And that's what I want to get into next is about your retirement, going into media, and also a little bit the time you spent with Andy Murray as well, and being able to have that and being able to see him
Mm.
develop and then go on to be Wimbledon champion and world number one.
Yeah, so I stopped in September 2007. Our youngest Grace was born 2 weeks before that. Had Davis Cup at Wimbledon against Croatia, World Group qualifying, and won my singles on the Friday. Andy won singles, and then I partnered Jamie to win the doubles, win the tie, hit a winner on match point. You know, I couldn't have scripted the end of my career any better, and returning home on the Sunday night, I was father of three, and I remember taking our two black Labradors out for a walk, thinking, what now? And it was sort of huge excitement. And funnily enough, if you would have asked me that, 2 days before, had I ever felt any weight of expectation, I would have said never. I've always been out there playing for myself. And when I took the dogs out for a walk on that Monday morning, I felt like the world had been lifted off my shoulders. And I think that, again, was very much a reflection of the world that, I lived in and had always been accustomed to. And so, retirement from tennis came very, very easily to me. I loved it. And when you talk about the media work with my children at that age were they were 5, 3, and 0 basically. I did work at for the BBC at Wimbledon in 2008. That was the first time I worked in the media, but I ended up doing, really those 2 weeks and maybe the Tour Ending Championships when it came to London. So I really didn't do any media work probably for the next 10 years. And for me, I felt so fortunate that I was there, all the time with my girls growing up and doing the school run and planning holidays. And I didn't have a massive inclination to get into the media at that stage. But then probably you know, 5, 6 years ago, was ready to explore, different opportunities and with my children a bit older and things a little bit more settled from that point of view. I've so enjoyed it, and obviously having the opportunity, with Amazon first and foremost, now with Sky Sports and TNT, working at the Australian and the French. I couldn't have enjoyed it more. Worked with some great people, and I was asked 2 years ago by someone, and they said, "What's?" And this can be a question, well, for all of you. Somebody asked me, "What's my ambition?" And I was like, "Wow, that's a really interesting question," because like Greg, I'm sure you're always working towards that next goal, that next ranking target, that next tournament win. And, retirement's different. And I was thinking, wow, what is my ambition? And I basically came to the conclusion that if I could have the next 10 years the same as I've had the previous 10 years, I would sign for that in a heartbeat. And it just made me reflect, thinking, wow, I'm very fortunate. I've got a great family, and in the things that I'm involved with media wise and partnerships, being involved at Wimbledon, I really enjoy it.
Yeah, I think we've all been very lucky to be involved in the sport somehow, whether it's through media, whether it's through Wimbledon. You know, family is obviously important. Health is your wealth. If you're healthy,
Yeah.
that's also an important thing. So I think ambitions change. Like for me, the ambition is let's grow this podcast business. There are other avenues outside of tennis as well. But it's not the same day to day that you and I had, where we're always trying to get to number one. We were trying to win tournaments. We were trying to do this. We were trying to achieve all those other things. So it's always a different thing. It's almost like you've had that really goal-oriented life, and now you figure out what you're going to do with the next 30, 40 years of your life.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Tim, do you play at all anymore?
I don't really. I play a couple of times a year, and normally it's around charity, and you know, Greg has been supportive in some of the stuff that I do with my foundation. My foundation, we provide sporting and educational opportunities for disadvantaged young people, and my main fundraiser is where I play tennis for 24 hours at Wimbledon, 12 hours on a Saturday, 12 hours on a Sunday, and get a famous person to support for each hour, and then auction the other two spots off. And yeah, it's been great. I really enjoyed that sort of string to my bow, if you like. And so from a tennis point of view, I just don't really play tennis a great deal. And I love tennis. I'm passionate about tennis. I'm involved in tennis, but I just don't really have an inclination to play.
When is your next event? Are you running this annually? Your foundation
Yeah, it's
event?
December. It's the end of November, beginning of December. It's normally over a weekend. I've been fortunate enough to do it on the indoor courts at Wimbledon. And Greg has supported there, and it's hard. 12 hours in a row on court is not great for the body, but it's all for a worthy cause.
Amazing. We'll have to get the off court with Greg team there. We'll see if Kevin can strike a few.
There we go.
You can teach me, guys. Tim, can I ask you just briefly about coaching? I know you've done United Cup and whatever else in recent years. You said to me before that you weren't keen to travel the world again. That's why you never got involved. But I did hear a rumor that Mr. Federer might have asked you at one point to be his coach. Is that true?
Yeah, a long time ago. So firstly, addressing coaching. If you're going to coach on the tour, it's a big commitment. And, you know, I talk about my media work, and you know, I'm going to the slams and a few other events. You know, I might be on the road 12 weeks, which again is a perfect balance. I think realistically, if you're going to work with any player, let alone a top player, I think you're going to double that. And I don't have the desire, first and foremost, to be, you know, back on tour in that capacity. But yeah, a long time ago, I had two coaching offers, Federer and Murray, and I said no to them both. So I think I sort of set the bar pretty high. So yeah, no, and you know, it may change. I'd be very, very surprised if it does, but I'll never say never, because you know I love tennis.
No temptation, even with Murray being the Brit, kind of. Was that not like even a part-time role? So was that sort of something you could?
No, again, exactly the same. You know, why? You know, no disrespect, but you know, why would I turn down Murray if I've turned down, you know, Federer type thing? It's just you know, the coaching element of it. I didn't want that commitment, that structure of, you know, the practice away from tournaments and then the time at tournaments. So nothing personal, Roger or Andy.
But okay, so I want to get into a little bit about your media work right now, because we're in a generation right now where we have the big three. Djokovic is still going, and now we have Alcaraz and Sinner, who are basically separating themselves from the pack. And what do you see right now in men's tennis? And are there any people you feel like can really narrow that gap between those two, have separated themselves from the last 2 years?
It's been phenomenal, Greg, to watch, you know, what they have done. And I think there were plenty of us that were a bit concerned about what the future looked like when Federer and Nadal and, you know, Murray and at some stage Djokovic step away from the men's game. The way Alcaraz and Sinner have stepped up is incredible. And I remember the first time I saw Alcaraz, I don't know, it might have been the same time as you, Greg, when he played at the Albert Hall against Jack Draper. And you know, anytime the Spanish players get excited about a youngster, you're like, with their standards so high, you're like, this guy must be good, and it's phenomenal. And likewise with Sinner. Can someone close the gap? I'm not really seeing it right now. The person that was knocking on the door this time last year was Jack Draper. You know, he played some phenomenal tennis, and I do think he has a game style. Talking of big lefties, you know, with the weapons that he's got, you know, you'd like to think that he has a chance. He's got to build up that physical resilience. He's struggled with his body at different stages. Zverev was disappointing to the end of last year, and actually has played some good tennis. He has some weapons that I think if he used properly, I mean, his serve is phenomenal. He serves at 75% and he serves big, but I think his court positioning is just too defensive. I don't think you can just beat Sinner or Alcaraz from the back of the court. They're too athletic. Their ball striking's too good. So you've got to bring another dimension to the table. And who has that extra dimension? The way Djokovic played in Australia in that semi-final was phenomenal. And I don't think anyone saw that coming. But the way he played so aggressively, taking the ball down the line and not missing, was hugely impressive. But ultimately he couldn't sustain that. So I think the long answer to your question is, Greg, I don't see anyone closing the gap just yet, but I would like to be proved wrong.
Yeah.
I love Sinner and Alcaraz. They're great players, great guys, but if they're playing in every Grand Slam final, I'm not sure that's so appealing.
Yeah, I mean, you had Mensik who beat Sinner last week, but I got to go back to one prediction because we talked at the beginning of the show how Kevin Palmer, was a big fan of yours when you were playing. He also made the same prediction as you as the beginning of the year. He said Sinner to win all 4 majors. So both of you got to rejig that prediction.
Greg, what I try and do is on different platforms give a slightly different answer. So on some platform somewhere, I will have said that Alcaraz is going to win Australia. So it was Sinner on hard courts. I don't think I was the only one thinking that he was going to win in Australia. But fair play to Alcaraz. There's been quite a lot of noise about him getting rid of Juan Carlos Ferrero, which certainly took me by surprise. But the way that he, played in Australia was fantastic.
Yeah. And we're nearly to the end of this, but I want to ask you a question about commentary because we read in the newspapers that the BBC is thinking of a change up for Wimbledon this year with the team around there. Have you heard any news about the change up happening at BBC and whether they're going to be changing anything in the Wimbledon coverage?
No, I haven't. In all honesty, I saw that Roddick has just signed up with ESPN, so he's going to be on site, and which I think is a great addition. I think I've listened to some of his podcast stuff, and he's always been an articulate and an amusing guy. So could the BBC get a bit of Roddick time? I would certainly hope so, but no, it's in terms of what's going on this year at Wimbledon, I'm none the wiser. But look, the BBC have been at Wimbledon for a long time, and you've got to keep elevating in all areas. So hopefully they're going to be able to do that.
Amazing. Now, Tim, we're going to finish with a set of quickfire questions. I'm not too sure how it will work on a podcast because I was thinking of getting you and Greg to both answer the question at the same time. So let's give it a go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of ask you a question and you're going to answer which one of you it relates to. First question. Biggest weapon, Greg Rusedski's serve or Tim Henman's volley?
Oh, my serve.
Greg's serve.
I don't know why Tim, I slice my backhand. I have a double-handed backhand, but I use it 1% of the time because of you, because of the matches I watched you playing. So I don't know why the slice isn't in there. Okay, next question. Who was the most tactical out of the two of you?
Both of us?
Me.
Like it, Tim. Like it. Okay, 3. Who trained the hardest physically?
Both of us.
Yeah. I'd say we both put our time in the gym.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's most likely to make a bad line call?
Oh, I mean, in Davis Cup, we had some pretty tight practice sets. So,
boy. I'd say neither of us.
I think we were pretty fair, but I remember some of those Davis Cup practice sets were pretty intense.
So, Tim, you can't remember a time where Greg hooked you?
No.
Okay,
I
nice.
don't remember a time. I don't think that's in our repertoire.
We needed Hawkeye in those practice sets.
Okay, so next question. We see that the court conditions and the ball conditions are a bit slower today. In your peak, both of you, who would have won with these conditions today, with the slower conditions?
That
Tim.
favors me. Yeah,
Yeah, good.
definitely.
You agree on
Yeah.
that one. Okay.
Yeah.
Who has the best fashion sense?
I'd say me.
I'll give Greg that one. Greg's probably paid more attention to fashion than I have.
Tim's the new TikTok star now. Tim, you're on TikTok all the time. I don't know what's going on with you and Laura Robson putting out TikTok and dancing.
Sim Talk, isn't it?
Is it Tim Talk? Sorry, yeah, okay.
We'll put a link in the description below, folks, if you want to watch Tim talk.
Please don't. Please don't.
Okay, one word to describe playing each other back in the day.
Stressful.
Annoying.
Nice.
No, I think that they're pretty accurate words as well. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Which current player plays most like yourself? So you'll have a separate one each. So for Tim and for Greg, which current player?
Giovanni Mpeci Pericard.
Not bad. Wow. Help me, Greg. I mean,
there's not really a complete all-court player.
Who's finishing most points at the net now?
I would say probably the closest to you would be Grigor Dimitrov.
I was going to say Grigor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's probably a bit more baseline orientated, but because no one else comes to the net, he does finish points at the net. So,
well, it's also the conditions. I mean, if you played in this generation, we wouldn't be able to S and V all the time as well.
No.
I think that the big servers are coming in, but there aren't many players that are coming in off a slice backhand. You know, it's not the same, is it?
No, not at all.
Grigor. Okay. Who's most likely? We've kind of answered this already. Who's most likely to coach again on the tour?
I would if the right person comes on. So I don't know. It depends on the job offer.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to back the right horse. That's for sure.
Final question. I know, Tim, you're not playing much and Greg's not playing much either, but who would win if you both stepped on court today?
Greg would definitely.
Oh, I don't know who'd be left walking after the match.
Know.
That's the question. I mean, I only play doubles, no singles anymore, please. That's enough.
Honestly, it would be embarrassing. It would be such a bad match.
We should film it.
People would come in with sort of expectations of big serves and covering the net. We'd be hobbling around with Greg's knee and my shoulder. It would just be a bad look.
That's why I only play the Invitational at Wimbledon and mixed doubles or doubles. That's still fun. I still enjoy the doubles. If we're talking about golf, it's a one-way traffic with Mr. Henman winning the golf all the time with his handicap +2. But, you know, what can I say? But I just want to say a big thank you to Tim for taking the time today. Really appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you for joining us on Off Court with Greg Rusedski. Subscribe, listen to the podcast, and thank you very much for being on our show today, Tim.
Pleasure, guys. Thanks so much for having me and look forward to catching up sometime soon.
Thanks, Tim.
Oh, it's great. Really, really enjoyed it. It's fun to reminisce about some of these things going back in time.